So this happened last year in Virginia, and it's also the reason I never backpack alone anymore. I was taking summer courses at the time, and we ended up with a 3-day weekend in June, so I thought it was a great time to go explore some of the Virginian wilderness. I did a Google search and found a state park with a trail that looked nice, and I let my roommate and family know the trail I was going to be on. When I got close to the park area, I saw a little outdoor shop where people were hiking. I went in to grab a map of the area just in case I got lost. As I was talking to the owner, he mentioned a trail that's not well known that has a pretty cool waterfall and a swimming hole. This really piqued my interest, so I had him show me on the map. It took me outside of the state park, but he said it was a great place to go. I paid for the map and thanked the owner. I texted my roommate and parents about the new trail, and I parked my car and set off on my adventure. I should also note that the waterfall was going to be a side trip from my journey. I was planning 3 days and 2 nights. I started on the part of the Appalachian Trail, and it was pretty packed with people, and some of them were really fun to talk to. As expected, as I got further and further from the main trail, I saw less and less people. Around early afternoon, 3 miles from my destination, I noticed it was unnaturally silent. No birds, no bugs, not even wind, and I had a feeling of being watched. I just shook it off as me overanalyzing the situation. I got to the waterfall, and it wasn't too spectacular, but it was cool to look at. Plus it had a good sized area to swim in, so naturally, I stripped down and took a dip. I must say, it was pretty refreshing. As I was getting my clothes back on, I started whistling to myself. It was Chill Bell because it was stuck in my head. That's when I heard something whistle the same tune back. At first I thought it was a bird copying me, so I went back and forth with it, and it repeated whatever I whistled. I thought it was pretty neat. Later in the day, as I was setting up camp, I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched again, and I'd get goosebumps and my hairs would stand up. As night fell, I built a small fire and began to make dinner, and as I did this, I became hyper aware that again, there was no sound, just deafening silence. There was a part of my brain that was telling me that I'm not safe and I need to leave. However, I ignored it and crawled into my tent with my flashlight and a book. I went to sleep without incident. When I woke up the next morning, my sight was trashed. My camp stool was nowhere to be found. My bear bag with my food was cut down, and the contents were thrown across the site. My first thought was a crafty animal chewed through the rope and got at the bag, but when I looked at the rope, it was cut with something very sharp. Plus, none of the food was even touched. I also noticed bare footprints all around my campsite. Keep in mind, I'm at least 6 to 8 miles from a road. As I was looking at the mess, I heard a branch snap off in the distance, and I immediately turned around to look in that direction. I saw nothing, but I heard that whistling again. My whistle from yesterday, but it was different, and it sounded more sinister. It made my hair stand on end, and this is when I listened to my instincts to get the hell out of there. It sounded like it was a little off in the distance, so I packed up my camp as fast as I could. The whistling got closer as I finished stuffing the tent into my bag. I didn't bother putting anything away properly. The whistling was constant and sounded like it was coming from all directions. I ended up getting fed up with the whistling, so I stood up and I yelled into the woods. "Shut up! What the fuck do you want?" It stopped whistling, and it was quiet for a moment, Then it repeated what I said in my voice.
Shut up! What the fuck do you want?
It sounded just like me, but distorted like it came from an old TV. After I heard this, I immediately threw my backpack on and ran the direction I came. I heard it moving just behind me, fast, switching between the whistle and my voice. It felt like it was toying with me, not coming too close, but not being too far. Eventually it sounded like it got further and further away from me. Then it stopped suddenly. I immediately stopped in my tracks and turned around. I wish I didn't, because I heard the most bone-chilling screech coming from right next to me. That's when I started running again. I didn't look, I only ran. Less than half a mile, I ran into a couple that was also backpacking. They saw the look of terror in my face and asked if it was me that screamed and asked if I was okay. I told them about what just happened and they decided not to go down where I came from. We moved to a more populated trail as quickly as we could. As soon as I got back in my car, I drove to one of the park ranger stations and reported what happened. Since the site was off park grounds, they told me it wasn't in their jurisdiction, but they'll send a ranger to investigate. The ranger station's parking lot runs right up to the woods, and when I was getting into my Jeep, I heard the Chill Bill tune coming from the woods just in front of me. I've never drove so fast in my life. When I told my roommate why I was back after only one night, all he said was, "Bro, I'm never going camping with you." This happened a few years ago when I was 13. I was somewhat popular in school at the time, and I had around 4 very close friends. Rose, Lynn, Noah, and Zach were the main ones. We went on many adventures around that time: camping, road trips, the beach. Noah's family was pretty wealthy, and all of our families were pretty lenient with the rules. One day, the summer before 8th grade, we went on a camping trip with Lynn's older sister Margot and Zach's older brother Todd. So there were 7 of us. Lynn, Zach, and I were 13, Noah and Rose were 14, and Margot and Todd were both 17. We decided to go camping in a nearby forest, around 20 miles from Noah's house. It was pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Noah's house and his neighborhood were the closest homes, and there were no signals for phones or any electronics. We get to the spot easily and without problems, and we make our camp. The girls in one tent, the boys in another. Maybe it was a bad idea to have 17s, ages 13 to 17, with no phone in the woods. But our parents were lenient, like I said, and they were confident we would be fine, since the woods were not known for anything bad or dangerous. So we set up the tents, go swimming in a nearby lake, and come back and make dinner over a fire, which was about 20 feet away from the tents, which were 4 feet away from each other. We have s'mores and do all the stupid camping things before Lynn and Margot announced they're going to sleep. That left Todd, Rose, Zach, Noah, and I, as we joked around, told scary stories, and just overall had a good time. That's when Margot walks up annoyed and tells us that whoever it is messing with the side of the tent, that they need to stop it. Keep in mind, no one left the group, and the tents were far enough away not to bother anyone in the tents. She explains that someone keeps on touching the side of the tent, running something on it, but we just dismiss her and tell her that it's not us. Todd states that it's probably just a tree branch, and Rose and I decide to go to sleep as well. So we head back to the tent. Lynn is asleep, and we settle in, me closest to the opening. Margot was next to Lynn, who was at the opposite side of the tent, and Rose in between Margot and I I managed to fall asleep easily within 5 minutes, until I woke up suddenly for what seemed like no reason. I checked my phone. I still brought it and a portable charger just to take pictures, and it was literally the middle of the night at 2:15 a.m. I looked around, my eyes getting used to the darkness, trying to figure out why I woke up. A tapping sound on the tent was the first thing I noticed, and a soft giggling. It sounded somewhat deep, like a male voice, but I really couldn't be sure. After what felt like an hour, but was probably a minute or two, the tapping and giggling sound stopped. I was convinced it was just my imagination, or maybe one of the boys trying to prank us, or even a tree branch, like Todd suggested earlier. So I told myself it was just a tree branch and lack of sleep. I fell back asleep until Rose woke me up around dawn. Everyone was awake, so we decided to hike a little. We decided to go into 2 groups because we planned on spending the night again, and we didn't want anyone messing with our stuff. Even though these woods weren't popular with camping, we didn't want to risk it. Margot, Lynn, and Rose and I left to go hiking for a couple hours, while the boys opted to stay behind and fish, swim, and cook food. We hiked for about 2 hours, and when we came back, the boys were not at the campsite. Annoyed, Margot went down to the lake with Lynn to find them. Rose and I made our way back to the tents, and I'll be quite honest, I screamed and almost wet my pants. The tents were slashed. I inspected it closer after regaining my composure. It seemed like they were slashed with a small knife, as the cuts were very small. Our tents were also made of material that was pretty hard to cut into, and it seemed like the person had a pocket knife. The boys Margot and Lynn came running up to our screams, and they were obviously startled. We decided to pack up and head home early, because for one, the tents were ripped too much to use again comfortably, and 2, Rose, Lynn, and I were very creeped out, even more so when Todd announced that his tires were slashed. We were all freaking out, obviously. There was no cell service, Todd's tires were slashed, and there was no way any of us wanted to stay any longer. Luckily, Todd reported that Margot's tires looked fine, and Margot stated that she would take Noah and Lynn, drop them off and to call 911 and their parents, and then come back for us. She drove a car, and there wasn't enough room for more than 3 people, as the back was filled up with camping stuff. Zach, Todd, Rose, and I were left at the campgrounds, and we decided to begin a hike back towards the main road, so Margot wouldn't have to drive so far. Also, Rose and I refused to stay anywhere near the camp area. We began hiking. My phone died. The last time I looked at it, it was 1 in the afternoon. Zach and Rose both had working phones and constantly updated us on how far we had been walking. That's when I began to hear branches snapping from behind us, closer to the trees while we walked. I got more and more paranoid as time went on. I told Todd, and he seemed to get more wary of his surroundings, constantly looking over his shoulder. We had been walking for about 30 minutes. Margot was probably at Noah's house, or almost there, when Todd suddenly screamed, "Run!" Naturally, I looked behind my shoulders before I began running. 3 hooded figures were running towards us. 2 had knives, and they all looked around 6'3" or taller. Todd was 6'1", but I doubted he could defend all of us against them. Even though it was broad daylight, I couldn't make out any facial features. They all appeared over or around 200 pounds, and the shortest one was probably 6'2". But they all wore hoods and had masks on, like ski masks. I know, it sounds totally fake, and I really don't care if you don't believe me, but I was completely scared shitless that day. We began running, and the three guys finally gave up or decided we weren't worth terrorizing. We made it to the main road, walking quickly and constantly looking over our shoulders in fear until Margot arrived. We told the police everything, and they searched the woods nearby. They never found any evidence that we had been there, or that the guys were there, or that anything even happened besides pictures of the lake around the area and the shredded tents. I really don't know what would have happened if they had caught us. I'm fairly tall. I was around 5'10" during this time and only around 125 pounds. Rose was around 5'1" and 100 pounds, and Zach was barely 5'9" at the time. He probably outweighed me by 10 pounds maximum. I am so thankful that we were fast enough to outrun them and that they gave up. In college, I lived up on top of a mountain road, but still only 5 minutes to town, down a trail through the woods. There was a 100-plus-year-old oak in the yard, slab stone porch built by hand. I lived in the studio apartment that was outside of the main house. The main house was haunted, but my shack was cozy. The woods up there were really weird too. I was never really in the main house at all, but the three who lived there said some nights you couldn't sleep for all the noise. Floorboards creaking, thumps and knocks, etc. My experiences happened outside. I hunted small game up there, as there must have been a rabbit colony in the vicinity. Often out there while I was stalking, I get the distinct feeling of being stalked myself. Keep in mind, this stand of forest is only several acres, but was preserved mainly because of the historic oak trees scattered around. Some days when I would be hunting, I would hear laughter, like a child's laugh, but not quite like in a creepy movie. It was a bit distorted and almost like flirty giggles you might imagine a fairy would make. It would come from a different direction each time I heard it. I eventually decided to stop following it and I would just continue to hunt, but it never did stop. I would sometimes spend an afternoon in town, having drinks or hanging at my friend's place. I'd finally leave and have enough liquid courage to hike back up the trail in the dark. That laughter would be replaced by noise, just like things running all around you and dashing about the trees. I've been an outdoorsman for a long time, and I know the woods are noisy at night, but this night was different. It was dead silent out there, except for this rushing to and from by some unseen force. It didn't sound like game fleeing through. Deer run away and crash about doing it. These steps were like something running swiftly around me. It's like it would cross the trail up ahead and then behind me and then alongside of me, but I could never see anything. I was a big-time night owl back then, and I was usually up late doing schoolwork till about 3 or 4 in the morning. One such night, it had just snowed a fresh 20 inches or so. Our yard and the woods were like a paradise for me and my dog. I was excited to hunt around the next day for tracks and see if I could locate a rabbit den precisely. So that night, I was up late working, and the dog came scratching to get in, not frantic or anything. I let her in, and she lays down to sleep. That was really odd, because she's a husky and preferred the snow to my tiny heated apartment any day of the week. I decided to call it a night too and went out for a cigarette. It was about 3:24 a.m. I went outside and noted that the clouds were dispersed a bit and the moon was bright on the snow. I lit my cigarette and was just looking out across the fence and into the woods when something caught my eye. It looked just like a silhouette of somebody leaning against one of the oak trees, like you'd see somebody with a palm planted against the wall with the arms straight out, leaning against it. It's not moving, so I can't tell if I'm just tired or the lighting is funny or whatever. So I walked further to the end of the porch, and as soon as I stepped on the fresh snow, it immediately took off. The thing was tall, my estimate based on the tree, putting this thing at least 7 feet. It ran along the border of the fence and back off into the woods. It was hairless as far as I can tell, and just completely naked. Otherwise though, its form was just that of a skinny tall man. I went inside and switched to my boots, grabbed my rifle and my flashlight, and went to check the tracks. I picked up a set of what had to be size 14 or 15 bare feet tracks. It ran along the fence and down the treeless stretch of backyard as if it was heading into the woods, but then the tracks just ended about 20 inches short of the wood line. I don't know if it jumped the tree line, probably could have, but there weren't any more tracks that I could find that night or the next day. It was like it just vanished, and I could never really explain that one.